ask of me. I believe he's primed you to do that. So who would like to start the ball rolling? Yes, sir. What's your name?
William Potter.
Okay, William Potter, thank you.
With your involvement in the wars, what affected you the most during that time?
I think the biggest effect on me of that war was knowing that any friendship that you built up with anybody was only ever going to be temporary. You were really never sure that the friend that you had today was going to be there the next day, because especially in Bomber Command we had at one stage a 97% death rate. That means those people who went into Bomber Command, very few came out of it. They had the highest death rate, because you're kind of like sitting ducks really up there in the sky. Yes, sir.
Was it hard for you to leave your family? Like, were there any consolations afterwards?
Well, it was hard for me, but what had happened really was that I had a big argument with my father, and I left home at the age of 20 because I was working on a farm in the Waikato, and he wasn't paying me except a packet of cigarettes a week. So I went away and ended up becoming a truck driver. So for me, there was a sense of a great adventure going to war. And ironically, I was working in a gold mine in Fiji when the war broke out. So early September 1939, I read in the newspaper, heard on the radio and so on that this war had broken out, and I just quickly scuttled back to New Zealand as quickly as I could to enrol in the Air Force. Yes, sir.
Did you feel any guilt after you joined the...
No, not at all. For me it was a great adventure. It was an absolute adventure. I wanted to fly. This was an opportunity for me to fly, although it turned out that I was 1 year too old to be a pilot. But I was still able to get my wings, as you'll see, and fly, because I was, it started off as an observer and then I became navigator. Yes, sir.
We know that you weren't able to get in, but how did you get in? How were you allowed?
Well, what happened is they still have air crew. So any bomber plane has a pilot, and they have a navigator, and they have gunners, and they have bomb aimers. And all those people are part of the crew of any bomber plane. So initially we were on Vickers Wellingtons, and they had a front gunner, top gunner, a bottom gunner and a rear gunner, as well as the pilot and the observer, who was the navigator. As the bombers got bigger, the Lancasters, they had even more. But your job, if you were employed, you're still in the Air Force, but your job is a gunner, you're not a pilot. The pilots were trained to be pilots, navigators were trained to be navigators. Yes, sir.
Where were you stationed during the war?
Well, there's a couple of places actually. It's a good question. Initially, we went to the UK to train, and then the first campaign I did, because I did 3 tours of operation, and a tour of operation is 10 campaigns dropping bombs over a targeted area. 10 trips. Now you might not think that sounds like very much, but you think each trip lasts about 10 to 12 hours. And so it's pretty stressful knowing that you might get blown out of the sky at any second. And so my first campaign was based in the Middle East in Egypt. And then from Egypt I went back to the UK, and from UK we did the 1,000 bomber raids over Germany during 1942 and 1943 until I got shot down. Yes, sir.
Do you have any idea what was the purpose of the war?
Oh, well, that's a huge question. I mean, we knew that we had to defeat Hitler at all costs. We knew that the sort of things that he'd done and was taking back Poland inside, that he had to be brought to heel for that. So there was a sense, I guess, of justice in the crusade that we were involved with to try and make sure and help Britain. And in my case that was easy. I still had a British passport because I'd been born in Britain, but my family had come out to New Zealand when I was 14, and here it was 29 years old when the war broke out. So I thought, well, I'll go and do my bit, because that guy Hitler had to be defeated, and I wanted to play my part in that. Plus, I think, as I said before, with that sense of adventure too. Yes, sir.
What happened when you got shot down?
Okay, that was an interesting one, because I was on my 3rd tour of duty, flight number 7, so I'd done 27 operations dropping bombs over Germany and over Greece and Crete and so on, and we got attacked by flak over the target. And what happened is the plane started to explode, and so what we do is we bail out, of course. Now I think when I bailed out that I must have lost consciousness, because I can remember at the very last minute, pulling the ripcord on my parachute, and I know that I landed in the tallest tree in Germany, and I was upside down hanging by the ropes of the parachute, and I always carried a pocket knife in my pocket, so I pulled out a pocket knife, cut the ropes, and all I remembered is waking up at the bottom of the tree in the morning, and I just couldn't move because my back was so injured, and so I crawled into a kind of like a little kind of farmer's hut. And in the morning this girl came through, discovered me and called the Gestapo. I got captured that way, but I actually have this little lapel badge which is called a caterpillar badge, and that's for anybody whose lives are saved by parachutes. And it's because it's the silkworm caterpillar of the silk that makes the parachutes. And I'm a member of that caterpillar club because that denotes my life being saved by a parachute. Because they didn't have parachutes in World War I. Once you jumped out, unless you jumped into water quite low, the chances of surviving were pretty slim. Yes, sir.
You mentioned that the death rate was 97%.
Yes, at certain points of the war.
At certain points.
Yeah.
How did you feel when hearing that? Like, what went through your head?
Well, that comes back to my first answer to your question when you talked about the most powerful experience. There's that sort of very impermanent nature of friendship. Because you think about the friendship that you build during wartime is the most intense friendship you can. But you also know that it's possibly going to be temporary, because you have to steel yourself against the sadness of losing that friend. And that's nothing more cathartic in anybody's life than losing a friend. Some of you may have already experienced that. Yes, sir.
Did you make a friend and then watch him die?
Yeah, we did, yes. In fact, I was the only survivor of our bomber crew. And because our bomber crew was on its 10th flight over Germany together with my captain and so on. Now, you did change crews a little bit, because what they tended to do with New Zealanders and Canadians and Australians, they would tend to try and put them together in their crews so that an Australian crew would be crewing together, New Zealand crew together and so on. And that was quite sensible because, you know, from the POM's point of view, they'd say, well, they're the only ones that understood our accent. You know, when you're speaking through a microphone, which is what you have to do, because you think those planes, the engines are just so loud that you have to speak to each other through an RT, alright? And then you're speaking to the tail gunner, you're doing it through headset and RT. And your voice, if you've got an accent, can actually be exaggerated at that time. Yes, sir? Well, yes, that was interesting then. We got captured, and I think I was interrogated by the Gestapo, but I think I must have blacked out a lot. And I was always really worried that I would have given up some secrets. Because this is 1943, July 1943, so it's the early days of planning the D-Day invasion of Europe, which had happened in 1944. I was worried that I would have given up some secrets under interrogation, but it turns out after the war they didn't know very much. They didn't tell people like us too much information. And so I ended up being in Stalag-Luft 3. Now Stalag-Luft 3 was a prisoner of war camp, and the Germans designed their prisoner of war camp so that the whole camp was called Stalag-Luft 3, but they'd have the north compound here and the south compound there, and they're about 5 miles apart. Then they have the central compound, and then they have the east compound and the west compound. Now I was in central compound, but from one of the other compounds, I think it was north compound, which is the Great Escape Curve, where they dug the tunnels under the fence.
Yeah, the movie.
And basically I was in there. Now my job, interestingly enough, was to make ventilation units for the tunnellers. Now what we did is that the Red Cross used to send us these tins. They're like about a 5-gallon tin, made from tin of course. We would scrape the tin off and we would actually use them and solder them together to make them ventilation units for when they get down into the tunnels. And that was my job, to make those sorts of things. Because they needed those, because the further down and the further under they went the tunnels, they ran out of oxygen. They actually had to have some way of pumping fresh air into the tunnels as they were tunnelling further and further down into the tunnels, you know? Yes, sir?
When you're in the camp, you missed the, so like the end.
Yes, yes. What actually happened was that when the war was ending in 1945, so from 43 when I got captured, shot down, through to 45 was in the POW camp, Stalag-Luft 3. In 1945, what was happening was that the Russians were actually coming into Europe across Germany from one side, and the Americans and the British were coming from the other side. And where they met was really when Berlin, when Germany was going to be finally defeated. Now what happened to us, our camp got repatriated by the Russians, and they forced us to march for about 25 miles away from the camp, and it was a forced march by the Russians, not by the Germans, to actually, I guess, I don't know what it was, but it seemed like a kind of a political game to us. But basically the problem for me was I couldn't march, because when I actually got blasted out of the plane I broke my back, and so my back was broken, and what happened was that they put me on a stretcher when the rest of the guys were marching, and after the war they actually looked at my back and they did one of the first spinal fusions. Now what that means is that where the break in the back had occurred, all the muscles had built up around it to compensate for the break. And so they cut aside all those muscles and they took a bone from here, from the hip, and they put that into the back. There's a little straight section into the back. And it was one of the first spinal fusions that they did. So they had a little straight section in the back. And they did that after the war because my back had clearly been broken as a result of being blasted out of the plane. And they told me